I'm going to talk to Astead Herndon of the New York Times right now about updates from his earlier pieces about how people were reacting to the Trump victory. Astead, can
Yeah,
you hear
can you hear
me?
me?
Yes, I can. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, what's up? How are you?
I'm all right as one can be.
Yeah. I was
Uh,
listening to you talk about Homan and some of the other things. I think you're right to point out the broader strategy of kind of erasing civil protection. I interviewed Homan a couple years ago, and he's been planning this for years. And that's someone who's really serious about the broader effort of not just removing criminal unauthorized immigrants, but basically just changing the scope of the immigration system broadly.
yeah, it's a dire situation that's ahead of us, and I think, or a dire situation that's happening right now, but I think that actually dovetails nicely into what I wanted to talk about, which is, of course, how are people reacting to this? Now, you have a piece, you do this podcast called The Run Up for the New York Times, where you interview regular Americans to the best of your ability, and that's what we were going to talk about today. Updates on that. So I'm
Yeah,
very excited to have you.
we started calling back some of the people we met last year on the campaign trail as part of a process of bringing the show back. The episodes aren't out yet, and we're still going through the process, but we're already starting to see some things that really match up with some of the numbers. I mean, the biggest thing that came through is there is a sense of I think that of surprise of what we were hearing folks express that they feel like Trump isn't focusing on some of the issues they thought he would. I think we were hearing from people particularly upset around tariffs and particularly upset around the role that Elon Musk kind of has, the co-presidency of it all. That came up a bunch. But the other thing that really came through, and this is not necessarily about Donald Trump, is the complete collapse of faith in the Democratic Party. Among the undecided voters we talked to already, maybe about 10, 15 of them, even the people who have not liked what Trump has done, still did not regret voting for him. And almost all of them said that it wasn't a situation where they thought the Democrats would have been a preferable option. And so I definitely think that like there's an emerging picture here of Trump as a figure who has a lot of leeway among the electorate to shake it up, really. And I think that kind of premise is one that is actually really held. But the things that he has chosen to do that on, I think specifically the economic front and the risk of increased inflation or chaos driven by these tariffs have really landed as people as like not necessarily what they signed up for. But it's kind of different than some of the stuff we expect, honestly. There was a lot of leeway for him to focus on illegal immigration. I would bring up things like deportations and some of the things we've seen. And honestly, we saw people largely say they were okay with it. Now, I think it's partially a little different than what you were talking about. They don't really have a sense of where this might go in the future. But as of right now, because of the focus and the story they've been telling about criminal migrants and focusing on them, that has really latched on with some folks already. And so it's not
Mm.
really Ukraine or immigration. It was much more so Elon Musk as a person, as a figure, and also tariffs, really. And so, like, if we add up the parts of the America First agenda that weren't landing, it might not be what folks expect, but it does show this kind of shift in elector, which I think is part of the reason the White House is a little scared. I'm sure you saw today Elise Stefanik pulling back her
Yeah.
nomination for the UN ambassador. That's 100% because the White House is thinking about that congressional seat and the fact that they have really pissed off a group of people. And so, are Democrats the vessel to seize on that right now? I'm not sure, but there is an opportunity, partially because of the way that this White House has gone about fulfilling that mandate.
Yeah, the Elise Stefanik one is interesting. Definitely, there's like a lot of discontent, and I think one of the things that is probably too early for you to analyze is the Signal group chat situation, right? I think that that has also caused a lot of discontent and a lot of chaos amongst people who might have even been
Yeah.
Trump supporters in general.
That was happening on the day we were really calling people, and we heard it come up a couple times, but not necessarily in the kind of like Hillary email servers. And for sure, we'll see polling and stuff on this as
Yeah,
we talk to people more. But it was really just kind of like amateur hour example, and so people were referencing it as
yeah,
a sign of the White House's kind of unseriousness. Now, if
yeah.
that turns into something bigger later, I think we'll hear some of that more. But it was really just used as a sign that these are kind of folks who haven't taken the role in the office seriously. But, people really have and I'm reminded of this every time we do these efforts, people really have a sense that they think they know Trump and they think they know him better than everyone else. And so oftentimes when you'll bring up something, and, I was talking to someone and she was like, oh, well, Elon Musk will only be there for less than 6 months. And I was like, how do you know that? What's informing you? What's they're like, well, I just don't think Donald Trump will keep him around if he becomes too much of a nuisance. Like, people tell themselves a story about Trump. And so it really insulates him oftentimes from some political consequences because people just block out the possibility of certain stuff happening.
Yeah. I think it's like weirdly parasocial. It's cultish in the old terminology to use, but it's very parasocial in the sense that like they have confidence in Trump as the utmost authority. So virtually everything he does, it's actually for the greater good, and maybe we simply don't understand it. I think that's always been Trump's weapon, though, because he is a great room reader, and he's been able to cultivate such a fan base by, one, taking advantage of the weaknesses of the Democratic Party in terms of both messaging and platform, and then also been able to show himself as a strong leader. I interviewed two people. I went to the Bernie rally in Nevada. I was invited there by their team, and I interviewed Bernie and AOC there as well. But outside of that, I also talked to two Uber drivers, one that was apolitical but right-wing, and the other that was apolitical but liberal, one Kamala voter and one Trump voter. And I think the Trump voter, basically podcast guy, operating on exactly the boundaries that you just referenced, talking about, all of the irrelevant things that podcasters have told him are very significant and that Trump is like taking serious action against. But what I think was really enlightening about the conversation that I had with the Kamala voter was that she was a black woman in Vegas, and they were both Tesla drivers. I don't know what that means, but and she was basically saying like, there's no, like, I didn't like the Democrats either, but I have a feeling of discontent. I have an overall feeling of unease, so much so that I'm actually planning with my husband to move out of the country to a more affordable place, talking about potentially moving to Ghana or Thailand. Now, this is all TikTok related stuff that they've compiled this information randomly. But what was interesting about it was that she was uneasy about Trump's actions, but she brought up the point that at least he is a go-getter, if that makes sense. And I think that is really important to recognize when we look at the approval ratings of Donald Trump. Even if he's doing something that's like inherently chaotic, he's still seen as a guy who is doing anything. Whereas, and it goes back to the overall discontent that people have experienced and the overall lack of interest and trust that they place, or faith that they place in the institutions, because they haven't served them. So they look to Trump as a guy who, they might not agree with his methods, but at least he's doing something, as opposed to the Democrats who are doing nothing, the do-nothing Democrats. And the reason why I brought this up is because of what you just presented as what people are paying attention to, right? On either side of the political spectrum. They're paying attention to the silliness. They're paying attention to maybe the tariffs, which will have dire economic backlash for the average American, or at least that's how it's being presented in the media overall. And they're not necessarily paying attention to the erosion of the First Amendment protections that are currently afforded to citizens and non-citizens alike, and also the Department of Homeland Security deportation processes that are grabbing random people. Now, I think tariffs are still important. I think Elon Musk undermining the administrative body is very important. Having said that, what they're doing on the other side that people are not paying attention to will have far more dire consequences in the long run, I think, or at least they work hand in hand with one another. The reason why they're not focusing on it, however, still goes back to the Democrats, because I think that there's a real crisis of leadership in the Democratic Party, reflected by the attitude that these people you interviewed are demonstrating. But it's also because they are not directing their anger and resentment, or directing the anger and resentment of the overall population to these issues, to these like severe violations of the constitutional protections. And they're dropping the ball in a spectacular fashion, because I think if more people were aware of these actions, the media would cover it more. If the Democrats made a big fuss about these sorts of things, as they have done about the tariffs, as they have done about, Elon Musk individually, ruining the federal government, more people would be very, very worried, and they should be very worried. So I think both.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think
Yeah,
what
you
you're
go ahead.
laying out here is a huge point. Like the things that people focus on from the administration are not necessarily the things that are part of the broader project of executive power that is the goal of this administration. Like when we talk about Project 2025, it's not just a random list of things. It is a cohesive view of how conservatives want to reshape executive authority in the federal government. And so sometimes it's very hard for me when I'm talking to folks because I know that, right? Like I know those things. I've been in those conservative spaces. And sometimes you will hear parts of the Republican Party articulate that vision, right? Like for a lot of those Republicans, they take a lot of pride in the fact that they have reshaped their party from being the George Bush Chamber of Commerce style to this sort of a version of Republicans. But that's not necessarily what people ingest from Donald Trump. And so you'll hear the silliness come up all the time. Gulf of Mexico, America, Canada, 51st state, Greenland type of stuff. But you're not hearing the necessary, or even, I think Doge is actually a great example of this because people's focus is on Elon Musk as a person and kind of the chaos generally. But, one of the things we tried to do in a video I did for the Times a couple weeks ago was Doge is an effort that they are picking intentional legal fights because they have sat around and thought about ways that they want the president to have power to shape over those agencies. Yeah. They have rewritten executive orders for the purposes of the legal fights to come. And so these are all intentional battles that they're picking.
Yeah.
And I think that part gets really lost in the mud. And I somewhat think it's certainly a media challenge. I would say Democrats also, but I really think like sometimes we talk over the Trump project. And if it's just like, an individual caught following this individual crazy guy, I think you miss the broader point. Because a big difference, I think, between him this time versus last time is the way in which he has brought a movement along with him that has a specific vision. And so this time around is much more about exacting that and reshaping. I always go back to kind of executive authority, but you're right about about deportations, about free speech rights. I think they're intentionally going to pick some fights with media about press freedom. They're going to there are goals that they have that are just inevitable over the next several years. And the other thing I think is important to say is like one time I ran this past a couple Trump people being like, there's some real risk of backlash here, right? Like tariffs are largely unpopular, like that type of stuff. And they really just aren't calibrating themselves for kind of political midpoint. I think there is a sense that they have already experienced what it is when the government is all pointed fingers at them or what happens when they lose the House in the midterms. And they're kind of trying to make it such. They're trying to change presidential authority such. So even if they lose some House seats, Congress is just generally more irrelevant. Right. Yeah. So the goal of the next year and a half, the goal of the next couple years is about power in general and about a reshaping of government and culture that I think like they really don't even care what the political backlash is to that, because I think that goal is bigger than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, by the way, is the Unitary Executive Committee process that was actually entertained and thought up of far before Donald Trump even, when Donald Trump was writing or taking out op-ed or, full page New York Times ads talking about how we need to assassinate black teenagers in the Central Park Five or whatever, that even back then, the Republican think tanks were trying to figure out ways of undermining the legislative body and basically making the president a monarch. So this is quite literally an extension, maybe a logical conclusion of that. It's just Trump is the vehicle that will deliver this change to the American Constitution, it seems, or maybe someone that comes after.
And the first time he wasn't necessarily fit for that because they were so surprised he won the primary and they were so surprised he won the race that it was just a reaction. Now, as he's been the unquestioned leader of the Republican Party, him and the kind of heritage view that's been plotting this, you correctly to point out, since Reagan, right, have really linked up to meld their goal, to merge their goals. And so I really think that Trump experiencing those charges and his like retribution view allowed him to be a much better vessel for that kind of unitary executive theory, because for him it now works in terms of like power and exacting revenge from a set of enemies he thinks targeted him while he was out of office. But it really is a part of a longer project. And so it's hard even right now when people task like, or even I think there's a lot of Democrats who are saying, how do we get this energy channeled? What should we do? Like, how do we, what's the electoral response to Trumpism right now? And I'm like, I know that there's certainly, I think public pushback matters. And I think we've seen that in certain instances. But what their bigger project is to really insulate themselves from public reaction and to insulate themselves and insulate their policy goals from being responsive to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I try to stress, talking to Bernie, talking to AOC, what I'm trying to get them on board with is like my position, for example, on Israel and Palestine is obviously significantly different than the overwhelming majority, if not the entirety of Congress, including, but not limited to, the likes of Bernie Sanders and AOC. Having said that, the issue of going after student protesters and student activists without any sort of evidence whatsoever of like any sort of wrongdoing is not being done because these guys are truly terrified of, I think, students doing protests against Israel. Like, that's a secondary reason. The primary reason why they're using this issue is because they can use anti-Semitism and also pro-Israeli groups that play a formative role in the lobbying efforts against Democrats and Republicans alike to undermine constitutional protections for documented, undocumented citizens and non-citizens alike, with the ultimate goal of eroding due process protections and eroding, search and seizure protections, and last but not least, eroding free speech protections. And I'm really worried that a lot of Americans are completely oblivious to this because they either don't care or because like the Democrats themselves seemingly don't care enough about this stuff.
I think you're right that a lot of folks are focused on this. And there's a really tough part, even about the cycles that I live in my job, because the year after an election, you feel the electorate step back from politics mostly. And so a lot of the things even we're doing now is partly because I want to keep a tighter check-in with some of these voters to see what is even cutting through to them and what isn't. And it's sometimes, to your point, it's very rarely going to be that kind of larger articulation of political power unless media does a little bit of a better job putting those pieces together. And I think politicians can use a bully pulpit to focus their efforts on that too.
Yeah.
But, when you mention even Palestine or other things, I think that there's just not been an acknowledgement that Democrats are on the wrong public opinion side on some of this stuff. And it comes up in these talks, right? Like when we ask people about the moments where their faith collapsed in the Democratic Party, people bring up immigration. People feel like the Biden administration did not listen to an inflation and immigration crisis kind of in 2021, 2022. People bring up Palestine, that they feel like the party represented the status quo in terms of specifically supporting foreign governments or feeling like, we're supporting, slaughter in over there. And then people also, I think, and this has been a new one, honestly, every single person we talk to mentioned trans women in sports. And I don't actually think that was that big of a deal 6 to 8 months ago. But it has clearly become a thing that folks have latched onto about ways to show the Democratic Party is out of touch. And so even when we talk about a couple of issues where they're just legitimately, I think, kind of flagrantly on the wrong side of public opinion, those become stand-ins for people to say, this is just politics as usual. And they're the kind of like Democrats of the same, they're just swapping out faces on the same thing we already know. And those are the times they have really brought that up. But I honestly got to think on a couple of these things, I don't think Republicans are wrong to say that Democrats are on the wrong side of a 70-30 issue when it comes to trans women in sports. Now, they could talk to the public about why and try to shift that public opinion, right? You can lead. Like your other option here, if you're not going to change your opinion, is to lead and to tell a story about why this matters and about what's important. So that's your other option. But they're not doing that, really. They're kind of sticking their heads in the sand. And as they've done that, the Republican Party, and specifically this last Trump campaign, has defined them around kind of, that the ad they spent the most money on, the she's for they, them, not for you. It worked. And so I would say like a big difference, and even my interactions with people, is they bring that up every single time.
Yeah.
And that was not true last year.
So That's a really interesting point, and I think it goes back to the same thing that you and I have talked about time and time again, which is that, and it's something that I brought forward to the Pod Johns when I had a conversation on Pod Save America as well, both before the election and after the election, which is that if you are undefinable by policies and if you're constantly focus group testing and you're letting the Republicans dominate the messaging landscape, then yeah, you're undefinable and your enemies, the Republicans, will be able to define you to whatever position that they want to define you by. And that is incredibly successful and is yet another example of complete capitulation to the Republicans being super damaging to the Democratic Party. They got crushed on the messaging front because they were policyless. This is twofold. The problem is twofold. One, there's no counter messaging. Two, there's no definable policy that you can attribute to the Democrats that are going to tangibly improve people's material realities. If the Democrats could be, like Bernie Sanders, associated with a couple key issues, then it would be virtually impossible to say, no, this is what they stand for. But because the Democrats don't stand for anything, and look, we follow politics fairly closely. I would say a lot closer than the average American citizen, right? And I can't tell you what the Democrats stand for. Can you?
They stand for Donald Trump is bad. I think they stand for institutions are good.
Yeah, that's what exactly.
I think to me it's like a vague defense of institutions. But to your point, and I think, Ezra Klein and a couple others have been talking more about this, but there needs to be a language of improving institutions that Democrats were not engaging in because they were defending these things that people weren't invested in. And I'm glad that you brought up Bernie because he's really someone who I think when you're out in the world, and as I've covered both of his presidential runs, it's a helpful person to use when you think about the Democratic Party's future, because the type of people you meet who are Bernie supporters in places like Iowa or others are never the type that you basically see online, right? They wouldn't even define themselves as progressives. They don't even think in an ideological lens. What they do understand is they think there's too much money in politics. They think that they think the establishment has not helped change come about. And so the things that he's associated with are what is actually allowing that authenticity to come through. But they're not really thinking in the left-right, left-center binary. And so I always am telling people, I would meet people on the trail. I remember this, particularly in the 2020 primary, who were torn between Bernie and Michael Bloomberg, right? And they would think in our ideological brain, those are at odds, but it wasn't, because it was two people who they felt like they understood what they believed in and they had the trust in that. And I feel like when we talk about Democrats going forward, there's way too much focus on the individual policy position, like center, mid, and left. And I sometimes think that's driven by a centrist pundits and sometimes media who just want to punch at left. I'm like, the real thing I feel like I experience is a lack of authenticity and a lack of trust with voters that's not really driven by the calibration of ideology. But it's about how you're communicating to them and the fact that you really aren't playing in the things that people most care about. A good example is I hear about term limits all the time. I hear about people wanting to hear things about homelessness or how to fix, their education comes up all the time, right? There are things in which happen on the ground level that people just don't even play in on the politics level. And so I'm recalibrating that feels like much more of a useful exercise for the party over the next couple years to me than fighting over how to best perform Trump opposition at the State of the Union. I'm their problem is not whether you hold cards or not. And actually, in that one, I understand AOC not showing up at all. I understand Al Green showing up and yelling at him. I don't understand what they were doing in the middle, Yeah. And so I'm that to me is always their
even
problem.
Coming after Al Green, which was insane. Some Democrats actually criticized him as well for his actions. So it blew my mind, because what you're describing about key issues that people have anger around right now are also ones that they have come up with because of their individual experiences. They're not even being directed to be angry towards those sorts of things, right? This is without the Democratic Party leading them to get mad about specific issues like this. So that's free ball. That's free game for them to just pick up. So that's incompetence on a different level. My argument always is obviously, under the existing duopoly, the counterbalance to the Republican messaging has to come from the Democrats that actually whip up support for certain issues in the same way that the Republicans have. Because it's not like the Republican Party has ever cared about an issue being really unpopular. I mean, look, no matter which way they can, they get that across for their most loyal fans, for the tapped in 30% evangelical white Christian base. They will deliver something that is unimaginably unpopular. The abortion rights being taken away, women's bodily autonomy being taken away. Democrats would never demonstrate political courage of that sort. That's not even a question. And I think that they need to do that significantly more frequently and be associated with key policies and constantly talk about how good they are. Because if they don't do that, then the space is flooded by Republicans simply lying to create just cause for the immigration enforcement actions that they're taking place, or misdirecting people's attentions back to like the 49 trans athletes that were participating in NCAA competitions. Donald Trump signing an executive order surrounded by female athletes and making a big show of force is nothing but simple misdirection. If I were to remove the morality of transphobia versus protecting trans people, it is ironically no different than what the Democrats are being branded as. Silly people that only care about 0.1% of the population. Now, obviously, I'm saying I'm removing the morality because I think it is immoral to violate the civil liberties of trans people. But ultimately, it still plays the role of a distraction. When you focus on that, you think, oh, this person is doing something for me because I've heard over and over again that this is a major problem. And now I agree that this is a major problem because no one told me this is not a major problem at all. And the people that are ostensibly on the side of trans people are not doing anything for me at all. And even on the policy front, they're not doing anything for trans people. They're just aesthetically claiming that they care about trans people without actually ever doing any sort of serious protections for them.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, the other option is to stand up, right? Like, the other option is to do something. And so I'm like, when that's not taken, it makes no sense to me. But you're really right to point out the differences in where each party starts. Republicans force their moderates there to basically come along with it, or they will get rid of them. Whereas the Democrats work from the opposite premise. And I think it's also been different because Republicans have had much a bigger culture, particularly under Donald Trump, of fueling primary challenges, of ridding congressional members who do not follow the agenda, right? Like, all I heard at Trump rallies over the last 2-3 years was not even anger at Democrats, was an anger that they felt Republicans stymied his first term. And so when they were coming back for a second term, they were going to put pressure on Republicans to follow through on the Trump agenda. That's not how Democrats talk, right? And so there is definitely a difference in terms of the political project of both of those sides. But I think it's really a macro kind of loss for Democrats. This, 24, they didn't just lose the election. Their theory of the case has collapsed, right? Like, the establishment theory of the case over the last 8 years, since I think Obama, has really rested on a coalition of basically identity politics that they felt could overwhelm everything else. That if the other side was regressive on a kind of cultural front, that they could hold their side together, and that diversity, diversity is their strength, also overlapped with like a kind of demographic destiny argument. It's not true. And so all of the things that it's just not true, right?
It's woke racism. It literally is right, like, oh, these Mexicans, these stupid Mexicans will vote for us.
Right. We talked about this time, but this is a flattening of all those identities. And so what they have on their hands is a legitimate challenge where they need to find something that cuts through. But when we talk about homelessness or education or things, they usually, in my opinion, avoid the issues that would make rich folks mad. And that is going to be a problem for them if they're also, because those are also the issues that combine the types of people they're losing. And so I really think right now they have a couple problems on their hands. They lost the stands after the election. They lost people who are deeply invested in the party because they felt as if they haven't stood up for them. But they can fix that, I think, over the next year or so or going into the midterms. There's a base problem that I think is much more about malaise, is much more about lack of vision, to your point, and is much more, I think, about a misalignment between the people who they take their incentives from, whether it be media or donors or who are that, and the disconnects among their base. And so one of the reasons I think they over-indexed on identity, on representation, is because frankly, that is a language that works for a certain class of people who benefited from that. But that was never the language on the bottom. I was at George Floyd's memorial, right? They were not talking in that type of stuff, right? But it was something that benefited certain groups of people. So they have I really think they have like a soul search that's going to take a little bit, because if they want to touch, education or homelessness or tech or AI, they might have to make somebody mad. They might have to stand for something.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many of them want to.
Yeah. So therein lies also a structural hurdle for the current Democratic Party. The base being misaligned and their interests not being represented by the Democrats is to a certain degree intentional. I'm not saying that they're like controlled opposition, even though they kind of functionally are, considering that they serve the same corporate interests as the Republicans do. But the structural hurdle in terms of what you just mentioned, with Republicans saying we're going to primary people who are anti-Trump, is that Trump at the end of the day, regardless of the tariff stuff, is consolidating power, but not disrupting the pre-existing hierarchy where corporations are going to get massive tax breaks, right? So corporate bottom lines, corporate profit is still the number one thing that Trump wants to do. There might be a different vision of how to get there. There might be a different method of how to get there, but ultimately he's still very much in support of, the stock market always going up and corporations having record high profits year over year. And the issue is the Democrats also want that, and they can't shake themselves out of that, out of the 49-51% dynamic between corporate power, where it's like, okay, we have our woke billionaires and they have their reactionary billionaires. And when push comes to shove, it's obvious that the reactionary billionaires would much rather give in to the guy that's going to hand them the keys of the castle in the way that Donald Trump has. So seeing Hakeem Jeffries like run to Silicon Valley to, to give assurances to the remaining Silicon Valley tech CEOs that like, we will give you also unfettered access, was truly terrifying about the vision that the party has for its own future. Because yes, I think that they have to drop this thing and go full tilt left populist messaging, and that is going to cause a little bit of fissures within the party as it exists. But there is no other way out of this, because if they don't do that, then it's over. The party's over. Democracy, or what remains of the theoretical democracy, is over. And it's just all Republican authoritarian control all the way down from here on out.
By the time the Democrats get to the time where they can sort this out, which will be 2027, the country will be fundamentally changed, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Like, I think that we will be in a different place. I think our political system will look differently. I think that what I believe in this administration, I believe their seriousness. I believe their willingness to test every end and push past it. And I think we are only in the first stages of that. And so the midterms did not solve this. Like, one thing I have learned in going through this a couple times, a disjointed Democratic Party can still have a good midterm elections. Midterms are usually individual races that are vessels about dissatisfaction and do not have to deal with a broader vision.
Or special elections, even worse than the midterms.
They have a hyper-engaged group of people. Yeah. There was a reason why Democrats were doing good in special elections under Biden, even though that was not translating to the top of the ticket. So there's a lot of ways that they can make kind of individual inroads over the next couple years. But what you're laying out, and I think I'm laying out, and what I think is their core problem, is a vision question, is a alignment question, is an authenticity question. Like, I think they simply have the type of messengers who aren't used to being truthful, to be real. I don't think they're used to really answering and standing on what they believe in. Yeah. Right. And so as someone who has been going at these, going and asking about what is the core here? Why is things are the way they are. I remember doing this with Harris, really trying to figure out what is the vision that tells you why problems are the way they are and what you would do to fix them. We did this at the DNC. We were like, what is the difference between a Kamala Harris-led party and a Joe Biden party? Like, is it substantive? And those answers really couldn't come. But I actually would say, to go back to the Gaza-Palestine point, at that time, they were showing more openness to having a different type of message or policy on that front. And that was part of the reason there I do think there was that good vibe, right? And so I think as those things start to shift, and she sounds more and more like the current administration, is as that stuff dissipates. But there are litmus tests that people have about ways to show you're different than politics as usual. And so one thing I think is fundamental that what Donald Trump has done is introduced a different version of how politics can look. And so a lot of people have wanted that for a long time,
Yeah.
even if you don't like what he's doing.
No,
And so
he's
I think
fascist FDR. Like
yeah, I'm like,
100%.
and come in 2027, there is going to be a Democrat who tries to take that ethos and does something different with it. And I think that version is probably the one that wins out. Because I feel as if there is a palpable energy on the ground to rethink what liberalism is. I think there is a sense of failure from the party that's really pervasive. And we felt that last year as part of the reason Donald Trump won in the first place. The sense of like what has happened, and we did, Democrats telling us we did not send our best in 2024, and we're dealing with that. They kind of feel like they led Donald Trump back to the White House more so than he wanted. That's what's driving this. And so I just don't think that goes away, even if, they went back the House by a couple seats in a year.
Yeah, I do fear that they will learn no lessons and keep doing business as usual and consistently try
But
to.
what I'm saying is that they might actually just do the same thing. What I
Yeah,
think is going to happen is an outsider is going to push them in 2 years. So the
hopefully.
sentiment doesn't actually require an establishment seizing and understanding it. It just requires some type of figure emerging. And all I'm saying is like there is the ground is really ripe for that.
Yeah. No, I think that's precisely what Bernie is trying to do right now because look, independent, democratic socialist, whatever, doesn't matter. He still is a party man. Like he has caucused with the Democrats in perpetuity for the 800 years that he's been in Senate and the 900 years that he's been
Particular party
alive.
man under Joe Biden. He really likes Joe Biden and
Yeah.
was a fairly deferential party member for Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm like, it's not just these caucuses with Democrats, but specifically with Joe Biden's Democratic Party, he was a pretty loyal party member.
Yeah. And I think inevitably that's where, like, as someone who has a lot of respect for Bernie Sanders, on that issue specifically, I find myself at odds with him because I think he still believes that if he does all of these rallies, if he does, tens of thousands of people show up all around the country to these struggle sessions where everyone is talking about their issues and whatnot, that the Democrats will look to that and go, oh, we got to do that too. I think that is ultimately short-sighted in terms of if all of that energy and all that momentum, I think, is not directly being funneled into issues that are currently undermining the American future, the preservation of the Constitution, things that Americans, if you ask them directly, would say they care about, certainly, but currently they're not aware of. If they don't actually move all of this organization and all these people that are, getting agitated and supporting Bernie Sanders in that direction, I think it's going to be for nothing. And that's what I'm afraid of. That's what I worry about. Or spontaneously, we're just going to have people running for office that are those leaders that you're talking about. But I don't want to leave it up to chance.
I will see. Like I thought 3 years ago that somebody would recognize that America thought Biden was like way too old to serve a second term. I was like, don't we all know this? But so I'm not necessarily believing that they're gonna like step up in some moment. What I guess I'm saying is I think that right now this is also a different community for Bernie than traditionally. Like, I think these are loyal Democrats who are looking for someone and who have come to him. And some of these people who I even see, I've seen at these things were people who were pretty skeptical of him in his like original presidential runs. These are people who are capital D partisan Democrats who are looking for a channel in frustration. If I am a regular Democrat in Congress, that's the lesson I would take from that. Was the Bernie's level of authentic messaging is actually really appreciated by a lot of questions of that base. I think that's a different group of people than the people who are basically ingesting Trump from afar right now.
No, that Bernie
And
wins the
so,
primary. Like those are the
right.
primary voters. Those are
Exactly. That's what
the
I'm saying.
capital D
It's actually really
Democrats.
interesting to me that in this moment he's gotten those people back, because those are the people who I will never forget. In the kind of I was covering Warren in 2020, and so many of her voters end up going to Biden, and not to Bernie, and a lot of that was really about partisan identity. Was about
Yeah.
was about their before they were progressive or left or whatever, that they were really Democrats, and that was their real comfort with Biden. It was a kind of traditional party politics.
Yeah.
And so Bernie has like, I think, done himself good in this moment by speaking to that sentiment. It's going to require someone who can get those who can speak in that language that brings, I guess I call them the stands back, but also bring back the people who have stepped away, who are not who I think it's much more about vision than the kind of expression of anger.
Yeah, no, this is like the most, in the most basic terms, this is exactly what I saw from the Pod Save America audience that were like shocked at what I was saying, because they were like, I agree with everything this guy is saying. How have I never heard this from CNN, MSNBC, or even Pod Save America? And what I simply was telling them is like, I want a fighter. Like I hate the Republicans, and the Democrats don't sufficiently hate the Republicans. They want to be Republicans. I think that's despicable. It's the proximity to the Republicans in terms of attitude, policy, and politics. Well, not politics, but policy that frustrates me. And I think there are a lot of people that want that. A lot of people want Democrats to actually fight. And hopefully,
well, they've really latched themselves on to the kind of Lincoln Project lane of people. I don't really know what happens there, to be honest. Like, that's the kind of relationship that's become codependent. But if I'm the Democratic Party, I don't know what return I've really gotten on that relationship. Not a huge one, in my opinion. And this election was, I think they drive the kind of like most engaged people, whatever. But if the premise was that you were going to win over a sufficient amount of like traditional Republicans or institutionalists, that was what 2024's entire premise was. From Biden era's Democratic establishment, was that the kind of coalition of the normal, right? I'm like, they have not proven to be, at minimum, they're not the vessels to reach those people, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, I really don't understand where that type of relationship goes. But their kind of codependence is really important, I think, because it's, I think, really encouraged Democrats to keep leftist kind of populist politics at a distance, right? They were making an alliance on another sort.
Yeah.
And so those are the type of relationships that I think are going to be very interesting going forward. It's because I do think they've got into this kind of unholy alliance with all of these Trump fleeing Republicans, but it hasn't necessarily, in bringing themselves closer to them, they've gotten themselves, I think, a little further from their base, or at least are not asking them the type of questions that are going to get them closer to their base.
Absolutely.
And so what they do on that front is part of my interest over the next several years. But to your point, like, there's not like a leader doing that, right? There's not a place for that to happen right now. And so that's why it's so kind of chaotic, choose your fighter. It's because there's not a centralized, person or vision or think tank or something they're working from. I tweeted a couple weeks ago, where's the Liberal Project 2025, right? I'm like, where is actually the version of the Heritage Foundation for Democrats?
Yeah.
And I'm like, is that abundance? Is that Ezra?
I was just about to say, I didn't know, that's your boy, all right. But I was going to bring that up. That was going to be my final question for you.
That's what I was asking before, but like now, I'm halfway through it. And I'm thinking like, oh, I think this might be it.
But I feel like that is the same calculated academic language that comes across cold and disingenuous. And it's a reskinned version of like deregulatory politics or deregulatory policies and a public-private partnership. Like, let the markets finally, let the markets do its thing, is not going to get us across the finish line, especially when the way that you are presenting this is still, no disrespect to Ezra, I think his beard looks great, but a bunch of nerds, okay? Like, they're... Like, the average American sees him, and he's
right. Ezra's job is to think, right? And so I think that's fine, right? But in the way that has to work in politics, it needs a messenger. And I think one of the things in which, what I would claim is like an abundance kind of Warren-y lane of liberals have not had is an ability to translate that message to a broader audience. And one, I would say some of those kind of, I don't mean this about him because I don't think he's actually like this, but some of those nerds haven't wanted to translate that message, right?
Yeah.
And there's been actually a kind of haughtiness around it
Yeah,
too.
it's smug. It's elitist. It is exactly
Yeah, so
what.
I'm like, I would say this all the time to some folks. I'm like, and I say this even, I mean, I would say that I include some leftists in this too. Like, if your message of defund, for example, this is an obvious one. Like, if I'm in Black communities and you haven't convinced anybody, if I'm in these Latino, if I'm in the places that are experiencing the brunt of police violence and nobody here agrees with you, that is an organizing problem. Like that is a problem that's completely independent of media, that's completely independent of Republicans on the other side. It feels to me as if some of that was not a desire to go to those people and feel like they are worthy of hearing that case. Right?
Or look, it's the abolition argument as well. Like I understand the morality behind abolition, and I understand that like many activists, if you talk to them, many anarchists, if you talk to them, are actually incredibly reasonable on this issue, where they're not actually saying like no more laws or no more like regulatory force. They just want to democratize the process better so that like the outcomes actually protect and serve the broader public. So on the messaging front, on the messaging agenda, yes, there is a lot of like on the left, I wouldn't say it's more so a problem with like academic language, but more so about moral purity and presenting yourself as like morally pure. On the neoliberal side, it certainly is. You're muted, by the way. You muted yourself.
Yeah, I was just agreeing with you. It's academic.
Yeah, it's this like academic language. Ultimately, I think, like I said, it still goes back to the structural hurdles when like the left is despised by both the liberals within the Democratic Party, and that much we have also seen in the way that like other people are now being moved into the left camp. Like when you're criticizing Indivisible and like, you know, other like Democratic Party funnel groups that are there to organize, door knock for you, fundraise for you, if you're calling them the Sunrise Movement, you know, if you're comparing them to like a bunch of, socialist Marxist radicals that demand too much, go yell at the Republicans. Like you've lost it. Like you've lost the plot in its entirety. You have no organizational capability and you have no interest in actually organizing at all.
I would say like that's a big lesson I took from the last couple of years. And I remember us talking about it too, was like remove policy, remove even politics. There is a process problem among the Democratic Party where they're not actually used to being in conversation with their voters. And so I actually found a lot of the politicians to be uncomfortable with a legitimate expression of democracy, as I would say, of people actually pushing back and thinking of their jobs as having to hear that. Because one thing I would always be like is if you had, to the point of Indivisible or something, I'm like, if you were someone over the last couple of years who weren't engaging with the fact of how Americans felt about Biden, you were head in sand. What were you as a politician outside? Like you could not tell me your constituents did not bring it up. You could not tell me that. I know that's true. And so I'm like, some of it is actually because the party had talked so much about, duty to the president, and they would not talk about duty to their own voters. They didn't even see their own job as being reactive to those voters. And so I'm like, some of what you're talking about here is like not even just the people involved or even the policies that they choose, but that there is a process problem among partisan politics where I would actually say Republicans at this point under Trump are much more used to interacting with their base and the uncomforts of that than Democrats are.
Oh yeah.
And so some of that is literally, I think some of that indivisible uncomfort is because I think particularly congressional Democrats aren't used to being held accountable by their own voters.
Oh yeah. No, and it is reflected in the high informational voter cycle. Democrats for years have trained their most loyal partisans into saying democracy is not important. These public servants are not accountable to the public. They are marginally the better option in comparison to the scary Republicans. And that's why you still hear it. I used to have a joke in my community where I'd be like, show me the pay stubs. Are you a DNC operative? Do you work for the Democratic Party? Why are you here defending the Democrats and their ineptitude for free? Like, it doesn't make any sense. You're not Neera Tanden. You're not Matt Iglesias. You're not getting paid by these groups. And yet here you are on your own volition defending the ineptitude of the Democratic Party, telling me that no, better things are not possible. This is not a winning message. And they've lost time and time again. And obviously, something needs to change. Something needs to change within the Democratic Party, or it's over. It's just completely done.
Among the people I know who I used to probably have that same thought, being like, I think this is particularly true of like, there's an identity piece to partisanship too. You feel as if defining yourself against the other side is important. But I feel like in reaction to this election, I heard Democrats kind of universally say that this was on them. And I feel as if that is not an election reaction I've universally heard. And it's not the same one as I hear online. I still see the kind of like Biden, dark Brandon Twitter talking about we just blame the voters, whatever. Like, I think that's like fringe, like kind of online hysterical stand. I think the majority of your normal Democrats legitimately feel as if the party failed them. And that's what you're seeing being channeled into the Bernie AOC thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's why there's an openness to different types of figures that there wasn't true before. And frankly, that's why you're seeing some outsiders, I think, like lurk around stuff. I mean, Stephen A is doing his crazy LeBron thing now. But before that, he was on, he was on The View talking about all that type of stuff, right? Like, I think there is a growing type of person who is acknowledging that, because I find 2024 to be indefensible. Like, the route to how they got there, I don't think a person in good faith can really defend that as a working party.
Yeah.
So whether it's message, whether it's the individual politician, or whether it's process, it's definitely something. Like, something led to that disaster.
No, absolutely. Well, Astead, thank you so much for coming on. Once again, always a pleasure to have you on. Is there anything you want to promote before we let you go?
Our new episodes are coming out in the next couple weeks. They will be running on the daily and the run-up feed, and I will also be doing some videos of the Times, doing some politics explainers about what to focus on during Trump. I think there's way too much news right now. I think you have to know when you cut through the noise. And so I'm trying to make up like a series of things of being like, okay, what are the terms we need to know? What are the things that you should know to understand the kind of broader project that we were talking about at the beginning? Because I feel like, that kind of targeted understanding of this administration will last a lot more than, getting the deluge of news that comes at us every day. So when you see it, share it, check it out, and tell the Times you want more of them.
Hell yeah. Thank you, Astead. Have a good one, man. All right, that was Astead Herndon of the New York Times, one of my favorite recurring guests on the show. Hopefully that was an enlightening conversation. Astead, of course, is not reflective of the broader base of media in general. So do not delude yourselves into thinking, well, a lot of journalists are on the ball and on the money. No. By definition, his job requires him to go out and talk to people and not stay within the DC blob, not stay within the DMV zone. And that is precisely the reason why he has these sorts of opinions and is broadly reflective of the values that you present in this community and what you've grown accustomed to. Remember that. But that's also part of the reason why I always say there are still fantastic journalists out there, and they're incredibly valuable. They're an unimaginably valuable resource, even at outlets such as the New York Times and many other places, despite the fact that on issues like Israel-Palestine, obviously, they have dropped the ball spectacularly, and not even dropped the ball, but like actively harm and do appeals to more genocide.